Rawhead Rex by Clive Barker. Read by Greg Blank. Of all the conquering armies that had tramped the streets of Zeal down the centuries, it was finally the mild tread of the Sunday tripper that brought the village to its knees. It had suffered Roman legions and the Norman conquest. It had survived the agonies of civil war, all without losing its identity to the occupying forces. But after centuries of boot and blade, it was to be the tourist, the new barbarians, that bested Zeal, their weapons, courtesy, and hard cash. It was ideally suited for the invasion. 40 miles southeast of London, amongst the orchards and hop fields of the Kentish Weald, it was far enough from the city to make the trip an adventure, yet close enough to beat a quick retreat if the weather turned foul. Every weekend, between May and October, Zeal was a watering hole for parched Londoners. They would swarm through the village on each Saturday that promised sun, bringing their dogs, their plastic balls, their litters of children, and their children's litter, disgorging them in bawling hordes onto the village green, then returning to the tall man to compare traffic stories over glasses of warm beer. For their part, the zealots weren't unduly distressed by the Sunday trippers. At least they didn't spill blood. But their lack of aggression made the invasion all the more insidious. Gradually, these city-weary people began to work a gentle but permanent change on the village. Many of them set their hearts on a home in the country. They were charmed by stone cottages set among churning oaks. They were enchanted by doves in the churchyard yews. Even the air, they'd say as they inhaled deeply, even the air smells fresher here. It smells of England. At first a few, then many, began to make bids for the empty barns and deserted houses that littered Zeal and its outskirts. They could be seen every fine weekend standing in the nettles and rubble, planning how to have a kitchen extension built and where to install the jacuzzi. And although many of them, once back in the comfort of Kilburn or St John's Wood, chose to stay there, every year one or two of them would strike a reasonable bargain with one of the villagers and buy themselves an acre of the good life. So, as the years passed and the natives of Zeal were picked off by old age, the civil savages took over in their stead. The occupation was subtle, but the change was plain to the knowing eye. It was there in the newspapers. The post office began to stock. What native of Zeal had ever purchased a copy of Harper's and Queen magazine, or leafed through the Times literary supplement? It was there, that change, in the bright new cars that clogged the one narrow street, laughingly called the High Road, that was Zeal's backbone. It was there too in the buzz of gossip at the Tall Man, a sure sign that the affairs of the foreigners had become fit subject for debate and mockery. Indeed, as time went by, the invaders found a yet more permanent place in the heart of Zeal, as the perennial demons of their hectic lives, cancer and heart disease, took their toll, following their victims even to this new-found land. Like the Romans before them, like the Normans, like all invaders, the commuters made their profoundest mark upon this usurped turf not by building on it, but by being buried under it. It was clammy the middle of that September, Zeal's last September. Thomas Garrow, the only son of the late Thomas Garrow, was sweating up a healthy thirst as he dug in the corner of the 3-acre field. There had been a violent rainstorm the previous day, Thursday, and the earth was sodden. Clearing the ground for sowing next year hadn't been the easy job Thomas thought it would be, but he'd sworn blind he'd have the field finished by the end of the week. It was heavy labour, clearing stones, and sorting out the detritus of out-of-date machinery his father, lazy bastard, had left to rust where it lay. Must have been some good years, Thomas thought. Some pretty fine damn years that his father could afford to let good machinery waste away. Come to think of it, that he could have afforded to leave the best part of 3 acres unploughed, good and healthy soil too. This was the Garden of England, after all. Land was money. Leaving 3-acre fallow was a luxury nobody could afford in these straitened times. But, Jesus, it was hard work. The kind of work his father had put him to in his youth, and he'd hated with a vengeance ever since. Still, it had to be done. And the day had begun well. The tractor was healthier after its overhaul, and the morning sky was rife with gulls across from the coast for a meal of freshly turned worms. They'd kept him raucous company as he worked, their insolence and their short tempers always entertaining. But then, when he came back to the field after a liquid lunch in the tall man, things began to go wrong. The engine started to cut out, for one, the same problem that he'd just spent £200 having seen to, and then, when he'd only been back at work a few minutes, he'd found the stone. It was an unspectacular lump of stuff poking out of the soil, perhaps a foot. Its visible diameter a few inches short of a yard, its surface smooth and bare. No lichen even, just a few grooves in its face that might once have been words. A love letter perhaps. A Kilroy was here, more likely. A date and a name likeliest of all. Whatever it had once been, monument or milestone, it was in the way now. He'd have to dig it up, or next year he'd lose a good 3 yards of ploughable land. There was no way a plough could skirt around a boulder that size. Thomas was surprised that the damn thing had been left in the field for so long without anyone bothering to remove it. But then it was a long spell since the 3-acre field had been planted, certainly not in his 36 years. And maybe, now he came to think of it, not in his father's lifetime either. For some reason, if he'd ever known the reason, he'd forgotten it, this stretch of Garrow land had been left fallow for a good many seasons, perhaps even for generations. In fact, there was a suspicion tickling the back of his skull that someone, probably his father, had said no crop would ever grow in that particular spot, but that was plain nonsense. If anything, plant life, albeit nettles and convolvulus, grew thicker and ranker in this forsaken 3 acres than in any other plot in the district. So there was no reason on earth why hops shouldn't flourish here. Maybe even an orchard. That took more patience and love than Thomas suspected he possessed. Whatever he chose to plant, it would surely spring up from such rich ground with a rare enthusiasm, and he'd have reclaimed 3 acres of good land to bolster his shaky finances. If he could just dig out that bloody stone. He had half thought of hiring in one of the earth movers from the building site at the north end of the village, just to haul itself across here and get its mechanical jaws working on the problem. Have the stone out and away in 2 seconds flat. But his pride resisted the idea of running for help at the first sign of a blister. The job was too small anyhow. He'd dig it out himself, the way his father would have done. That's what he'd decided. Now, 2.5 hours later, he was regretting his haste. The ripening warmth of the afternoon had soured in that time, and the air, without much of a breeze to stir it around, had become stifling. Over from the downs came a stuttering roll of thunder, and Thomas could feel the static crawling at the nape of his neck, making the short hairs there stand up. The sky above the field was empty now. The gulls, too fickle to hang around once the fun was over, had taken some salt-smelling thermal. Even the earth, that had given up a sweet, sharp flavour as the blades turned it that morning, now smelt joyless. And as he dug the black soil out from around the stone, his mind returned helplessly to the putrefaction that made it so very rich. His thoughts circled vacuously on the countless little deaths on every spadeful of soil he dug. This wasn't the way he was used to thinking, and the morbidity of it distressed him. He stopped for a moment, leaning on his spade and regretting the 4th pint of Guinness he'd downed at lunch. That was normally a harmless enough ration, but today it swilled around in his belly. He could hear it, as dark as the soil on his spade, working up a scum of stomach acid and half-digested food. Think of something else, he told himself, or you'll get to puking. To take his mind off his belly, he looked at the field. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just a rough square of land, bounded by an untrimmed hawthorn hedge. 1 or 2 dead animals lying in the shadow of the hawthorn. A starling, something else too far gone to be recognisable. There was a sense of absence, but that wasn't so unusual. It would soon be autumn, and the summer had been long, too hot for comfort. Looking up higher than the hedge, he watched the Mongol-headed cloud discharge a flicker of lightning to the hills. What had been the brightness of the afternoon was now pressed into a thin line of blue at the horizon. Rain soon, he thought, and the thought was welcome. Cool rain. Perhaps a downpour like the previous day. Maybe this time it would clear the air good and proper. Thomas stared back down at the unyielding stone and struck it with his spade. A tiny arc of white flame flew off. He cursed loudly and inventively. The stone, himself, the field, the stone just sat there in the moat he'd dug around it, defying him. He'd almost run out of options. The earth around the thing had been dug out 2 feet down. He'd hammered stakes under it, chained it, and then got the tractor going to haul it out. No joy. Obviously he'd have to dig the moat deeper, drive the stakes further down. He wasn't going to let the damn thing beat him. Grunting his determination, he set to digging again. A fleck of rain hit the back of his head, but he scarcely noticed it. He knew by experience that labour like this took singularity of purpose. Head down, ignore all distractions. He made his mind blank. There was just the earth, the spade, the stone, and his body. Push down, scoop up. Push down, scoop up. A hypnotic rhythm of effort. The trance was so total, he wasn't sure how long he worked before the stone began to shift. The movement woke him. He stood upright, his vertebrae clicking, not quite certain that the shift was anything more than a twitch in his eye. Putting his heel against the stone, he pushed. Yes, it rocked in its grave. He was too drained to smile, but he felt victory close. He had the bugger. The rain was starting to come on heavier now, and it felt fine on his face. He drove a couple more stakes in the ground around the stone to unseat it a little further. He was going to get the better of the thing. You'll see, he said, you'll see. The third stake went deeper than the first two, and it seemed to puncture a bubble of gas beneath the stone. A yellowish cloud smelling so foul he stepped away from the hole to snatch a breath of purer air. There was none to be had. All he could do was hock up a wad of phlegm to clear his throat and lungs. Whatever was under the stone, and there was something animal in the stench. It was very rotten. He forced himself back down to the work, taking gasps of the air into his mouth, not through his nostrils. His head felt tight, as though his brain was swelling and straining against the dome of his skull, pushing to be let out. "Fuck you," he said, and beat another stake under the stone. His back felt as though it was about to break. On his right hand, a blister had bust. A clegg sat on his arm and feasted itself, unswatted. Do it. Do it. Do it. He beat the last stake in without knowing he was doing it. And then the stone began to roll. He wasn't even touching it. The stone was being pushed out of its seating from beneath. He reached for his spade, which was still wedged under the stone. He suddenly felt possessive of it. It was his, a part of him. He didn't want it near the hole. Not now. Not with the stone rocking it like it had a geyser under it about to blow. Not with the air yellow and his brain swelling up like a marrow in August. He pulled hard on his spade. It wouldn't come. He cursed it and took 2 hands to the job, keeping at arm's length from the hole as he hauled, the increasing motion of the stone slinging up showers of soil, lice and pebbles. He heaved at the spade again, but it wouldn't give. He didn't stop to analyse the situation. The work had sickened him. All he wanted was to get his spade, out of the hole and get the hell out of there. The stone bucked, but still he wouldn't let go of the spade. It had become fixed in his head that he had to have it before he could leave. Only when it was back in his hands, safe and sound, would he obey his bowels and run. Beneath his feet, the ground began to erupt. The stone rolled away from the tomb as if feather light. A second cloud of gas, more obnoxious than the first, seemed to blow it on its way. At the same time, the spade came out of the hole, and Thomas saw what had hold of it. Suddenly, there was no sense in heaven or earth. There was a hand, a living hand clutching the spade, a hand so wide it could grasp the blade with ease. Thomas knew the moment well, the splitting earth, the hand, the stench. He knew it from some nightmare he'd heard at his father's knee. Now he wanted to let go of the spade, but he no longer had the will. All he could do was obey some imperative from underground, to haul until his ligaments tore and his sinews bled. Beneath the thin crust of earth, Rawhead smelt the sky. It was pure ether to his dulled senses, making him sick with pleasure. Kingdoms for the taking, just a few inches away. After so many years, after the endless suffocation, there was light on his eyes again, and the taste of human terror upon his tongue. His head was breaking the surface now, his black hair wreathed with worms, his scalp seething with tiny red spiders. They'd irritated him 100 years, those spiders burrowing into his marrow, and he longed to crush them out. Pull, pull, he willed the human, and Thomas Garrow pulled until his pitiful body had no strength left, and inch by inch Rawhead was hoisted out of his grave in a shroud of prayers. The stone that had pressed on him for so long had been removed, and he was dragging himself up easily now, slothing off the grave earth like a snake its skin. His torso was free, shoulders twice as broad as a man's, lean, scarred arms, stronger than any human. His limbs were pumping with blood like a butterfly's wings, juicing with resurrection. His long, lethal fingers rhythmically clawed the ground as they gained strength. Thomas Garrow just stood and watched. There was nothing in him but awe. Fear was for those who still had a chance of life. He had none. Rawhead was out of his grave completely. He began to stand upright for the first time in centuries. Clods of damp soil fell from his torso as he stretched to his full height, a yard above Garrow's 6 feet. Thomas Garrow stood in Rawhead's shadow with his eyes still fixed on the gaping hole the king had risen from. In his right hand he still clutched the spade. Rawhead picked him up by the hair. His scalp tore under the weight of his body, so Rawhead seized Garrow round the neck, his vast hand easily enclosing it. Blood ran down Garrow's face from his scalp, and the sensation stirred him. Death was imminent, and he knew it. He looked down at his legs, thrashing uselessly below him, then he looked up and stared directly into Rawhead's pitiless face. It was huge, like the harvest moon, huge and amber, but this moon had eyes that burned in its pallid, pitted face. They were for all the world like wounds, those eyes, as though somebody had gouged them in the flesh of Rawhead's face, then sat 2 candles to flicker in the holes. Garrow was entranced by the vastness of this moon. He looked from eye to eye, and then to the wet slits that were its nose, and finally, in a childish terror, down to the mouth. God, that mouth! It was so wide, so cavernous, it seemed to split the head in 2 as it opened. That was Thomas Garrow's last thought, that the moon was splitting in 2 and falling out of the sky on top of him. Then the king inverted the body, as had always been his way with his dead enemies, and drove Thomas head first into the hole, winding him down into the very grave his forefathers had intended to bury Rawhead in forever. By the time the thunderstorm proper broke over Zeal, the king was a mile away from the 3-acre field, sheltering in the Nicholson barn. In the village, everyone went about their business, rain or no rain. Ignorance was bliss. There was no Cassandra among them, nor had Your Future in the Stars in that week's Gazette even hinted at the sudden deaths to come to a Gemini, 3 Leos, a Sagittarian, and a minor star system of others in the next few days. The rain had come with the thunder, fat, cool spots of it, which rapidly turned into a downpour of monsoonal ferocity. Only when the gutters became torrents did people begin to take shelter. On the building site, the earth mover that had been roughly landscaping Ronnie Milton's back garden sat idling in the rain, receiving a second washdown in 2 days. The driver had taken the downpour as a signal to retire into the hut and to talk racehorses and women. In the doorway of the post office, 3 of the villagers watched the drains backing up and tutted that this always happened when it rained, and in half an hour there'd be a pool of water in the dip at the bottom of the high street, so deep you could sail a boat on it. And down in the dip itself, in the vestry of St. Peter's, Declan Ewan, the verger, watched the rain pelting down the hill in eager rivulets and gathering into a little sea outside the vestry gate. Soon be deep enough to drown in, he thought, and then, puzzled by why he imagined drowning, he turned away from the window and went back to the business of folding vestments. A strange excitement was in him today, and he didn't want to suppress it. It was nothing to do with the thunderstorm, though he'd always loved them since he was a child. No, there was something else stirring him up, and he was damned if he knew what. It was like being a child again, as if it was Christmas, and at any minute Santa, the first Lord he'd ever believed in, would be at the door. The very idea made him want to laugh out loud, but the vestry was too sober a place for laughter, and he stopped himself, letting the smile curl inside him. A secret hope. While everyone else took refuge from the rain, Gwen Nicholson was getting thoroughly drenched. She was still in the yard behind the house, coaxing Amelia's pony towards the barn. The thunder had made the stupid beast jittery, and it didn't want to budge. Now Gwen was soaked and angry. "Will you come on, you brute?" she yelled at it over the noise of the storm. The rain lashed the yard and pummeled the top of her head. Her hair was flattened. "Come on, come on!" The pony refused to budge. Its eyes showed crescents of white in its fear, and the more the thunder rolled and crackled around the yard, the less it wanted to move. Angrily, Gwen slapped it across the backside, harder than she strictly needed to. It took a couple of steps in response to the blow, dropping steaming turds as it went, and Gwen took the advantage. Once she had it moving, she could drag it the rest of the way. "Warm barn," she promised it. "Come on, it's wet out here. You don't want to stay out here." The barn door was slightly ajar. Surely it must look like an inviting prospect, she thought, even to a pea-brained pony. She dragged it to within spitting distance of the barn, and one more slap got it through the door. As she'd promised the damn thing, the interior of the barn was sweet and dry, though the air smelt metallic with the storm. Gwen tied the pony to the crossbar in its stall and roughly threw a blanket over its glistening hide. She was damned if she was going to swab the creature down. That was Amelia's job. That was the bargain she'd made with her daughter when they'd agreed to buy the pony, that all grooming and clearing out would be Amelia's responsibility. And to be fair to her, she'd done what she promised, more or less. The pony was still panicking. It stamped and rolled its eyes like a bad tragedian. There were flecks of foam on its lips. A little apologetically, Gwen patted its flank. She'd lost her temper. Time of the month. Now she regretted it. She only hoped Amelia hadn't been at her bedroom window watching. A gust of wind caught the barn door and it swung closed. The sound of rain on the yard outside was abruptly muted. It was suddenly dark. The pony stopped stamping. Gwen stopped stroking its hide. Everything stopped. Her heart too, it seemed. Behind her, a figure that was almost twice her size rose from beyond the bales of hay. Gwen didn't see the giant, but her innards churned. Damn periods, she thought, rubbing her lower belly in a slow circle. She was normally as regular as clockwork, but this month she'd come on a day early. She should go back to the house, get changed, get clean. Rawhead stood and looked at the nape of Gwen Nicholson's neck, where a single nip would easily kill. But there was no way he could bring himself to touch this woman. Not today. She had the blood cycle on her. He could taste its tang, and it sickened him. It was taboo, that blood, and he had never taken a woman poisoned by its presence. Feeling the damp between her legs, Gwen hurried out of the barn without looking behind her and ran through the downpour back to the house, leaving the fretting pony in the darkness of the barn. Rawhead heard the woman's feet recede, heard the house door slam. He waited to be sure she wouldn't come back. Then he padded across to the animal, reached down and took a hold of it. The pony kicked and complained, but Rawhead had in his time taken animals far bigger and far better armed than this. He opened his mouth. The gums were suffused with blood as the teeth emerged from them, like claws unsheathed from a cat's paw. There were 2 rows on each jaw, 24 needle-sharp points. They gleamed as they closed around the meat of the pony's neck. Thick, fresh blood poured down Rawhead's throat. He gulped it greedily. The hot taste of the world. It made him feel strong and wise. This was only the first of many meals he would take. He'd gorge on anything that took his fancy, and nobody would stop him, not this time. And when he was ready, he'd throw those pretenders off his throne. He'd cremate them in their houses. He'd slaughter their children and wear their infants' bowels as necklaces. This place was his. Just because they tamed the wilderness for a while didn't mean they owned the earth. It was his, and nobody would take him from him, not even the holiness. He was wise to that too. They'd never subdue him again. He sat cross-legged on the floor of the barn, the grey-pink intestines of the pony coiled around him, planning his tactics as best he could. He'd never been a great thinker, too much appetite. It overwhelmed his reason. He lived in the eternal present of his hunger and his strength, feeling only the crude territorial instinct that would sooner or later blossom into carnage.